This presentation was recorded at the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit. For more information, contact pollinatorfriendly.org.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I am Stephanie Frischie, agronomist and plant ecologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I am joined today by my Xerces colleague, Jennifer Hopwood. She is senior conservation entomologist. And today we're talking about urban soil life, invertebrate animals, and their roles in soil health. So I'll be sharing first some background and introductory information about soils and invertebrates, and then Jennifer will pick things up in the second half to go into more detail on some of those soil invertebrate groups of animals and their profiles, how they live, what are they doing, and then how soil management practices affect soil invertebrates, and she'll also provide resources for further learning. One slide here on the Xerces Society. We are an international conservation organization focused on invertebrates and their habitats. We were formed in 1971 by Dr. Robert Michael Pyle as an organization of butterfly scientists. Our name comes for the butterfly pictured here, from the butterfly pictured here, the now extinct Xerces blue, which was the first butterfly to be lost to extinction in the US due to human activity. And the goal at the time the Xerces Society was formed was to prevent the extinction of other butterfly species. In the 50 plus years since our founding, we've grown to focus on many more invertebrate conservation topics, including and in addition to butterfly conservation. We currently have around 80 staff across the US working on a range of program topics from endangered species, pollinator conservation and related habitat, pesticide reduction and mitigation, outreach and education about these topics, and then communication. As a nonprofit, the work we do at Xerces would not be possible without the financial support of our members and the foundation grants and other partners listed here. And specific to today's talk about soil invertebrates, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the funding we've received from North Central SARE, Western SARE, and Northeast SARE to support our soil life project at Xerces. And also thank you to Lori and the Pollinator Friendly Alliance for organizing the symposium and bringing us all together virtually to talk about pollinators and related topics. So first, just a refresher that invertebrates are the groups of animals that don't have a backbone. Some are entirely soft-bodied like slugs, and some have exoskeletons or shells. Invertebrates are an extremely diverse group. Around 70% of all described species that we share planet Earth with are invertebrates, and a remarkable 95% of the described animal species, that's what's pictured here in this pie chart. All the turquoise and blue wedges or pie pieces are invertebrates. So over 95% of animal species are invertebrate species. Of all these, you can see insects are the largest group by far. And within insects, it's estimated that roughly 1 to 2% of these species are considered pests by humans because they're causing some type of damage to our interests or activities. So a small proportion of those. So with so much invertebrate diversity and insect diversity, the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. As we'll see a bit more today, they're involved in a lot of things related to soil health, pest control, ecosystems, and ecological function, and that includes crop pollination, which is one of the ways that insects turn plants into food for other animals by making the seeds or fruits that we and other animals eat, as well as pictured here, the eastern bluebird feeding insects directly to their young that they're raising in the nest. Yet, research after research tells us that so many invertebrate groups are in decline. And decline here means that the number of individuals or the number of species are decreasing as they're measured over time. And there's this telling study published in 2017 where the biomass of insects in nature reserves in Germany decreased by 76%. And, to me, what's really powerful here is that this was in nature reserves where presumably insects would be more protected rather than less protected from threats. However, such significant declines were measured. As a representative insect here, I've chosen a firefly or a lightning bug. It's hopefully a fairly recognizable insect to many of you. And this is a bit of a connecting insect here, because as we'll see later, fireflies are one of our soil invertebrates. They're not just beautiful lanterns flying in the summer sky. What about soil invertebrates and this topic of insect decline? Almost anywhere that invertebrates have been studied, they too have been measured to be in decline. So for instance, so from a recent review, this quote is here, looking at trends in invertebrate populations globally, where the author said, soil invertebrates in the soil-dwelling larval stages of flying insects, which represent a major biodiversity pool in terrestrial ecosystems, have been woefully neglected in many biodiversity databases and assessments, as well as in conservation actions and policies. And given that a major fraction of invertebrates lives below the ground, and considering their significant functional role, biodiversity monitoring urgently needs to include soil organisms and their functions. So we've found this a compelling and interesting topic and are hoping to do a little bit toward this call to action here with our soil life work and talking with everyone here today. I want to just pause and acknowledge a question you may be asking yourselves. How do soil invertebrates fit into an event called Best Practices for Pollinators Summit? Well, I'd offer two answers. This summit is, yes, focused on pollinators, but includes many related topics. And in fact, as I've alluded to already with the firefly, many insects that we see above ground, they live in the soil and are part of those soil systems for at least some part of their life cycle. And so many of the pollinators that we're talking about today are also soil invertebrates. Jennifer's going to talk a little bit more about bees, and we've heard from Heather as well, where we saw soil or the ground nesting bees in their life cycles. On the right here is a firefly larva. Fireflies aren't pollinators. They don't feed on plant pollen or nectar. Rather, they're carnivores and they're predators of soft-bodied animals like slugs. These firefly larvae live near and on the soil surface, especially where there's moisture. And the larvae of most fireflies glow. So if you've ever had the fortune to see glowworms, those were actually firefly larvae. And although it can be difficult to get into the soil, as soon as you dig or move things, any invertebrates that are there try to crawl away or escape. But you can lift a board, a brick, or a rock, and that's a familiar way to catch a glimpse, such as the earthworms and the beetle grub that are seen here in the central photo. Okay, we'll shift here a bit for some background about soil. Soil is not dirt. If you've ever had a soil science course, at least for me, that was one of the first lessons we were taught. Rather, it's this magnificent skin that is on our planet here. It's habitat for plants, microbes, and animals. Soil is also where the water supply is regulated and filtered, where recycling and storage of organic matter happens. It's a huge part of the carbon cycle. And also from just a very human perspective, we build on soil, we build our buildings and roads on soil, and sometimes even in certain cultures and climates, we use soil as a building material. To look at on the left, what is clearly a soil is this has mineral particles, it has living plants and animals, dead plants and animals. There's structure to the soil. There are these horizons or bands that are formed. The soil is intact and it's in place. And then moving to the right along this continuum, we have a pile of topsoil here that is more accurately referred to as soil material. It's disturbed, it's removed from its original place, it's isolated to some degree, and typically it will be less alive than the true soil that's in place. And then, as I said before, dirt or debris, what you sweep up in a dustpan, it's not alive, and that is also not soil. So this takes us to our focus, that soil is full of life, from the tiniest microbes like bacteria, fungi, and protists, and increasing in size to mesoinvertebrates, macroinvertebrates, and then of course, land plants and vertebrate animals. All kinds of things live in soil. We're the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, so we don't focus much on these microbial groups of fungi and bacteria here, but they are so important, both in the terms of the biomass and diversity and in their roles, that I do want to just show this slide here in the bullet points that highlight everything that bacteria and fungi are doing in the soil communities. Here we do get into an illustrative diagram of a soil food web. So we're going to see how energy flows here. That's what's represented by the green arrows. And if we start where the green triangle is in the lower left with organic residues, those are the dead plants and dead animals. And then we bring in bacterial groups here that are feeding on and breaking down the organic residues. And then some of these very small animals like rotifers, and then the other non-animal groups like protozoans can feed on those bacteria. And further, if we look at fungi as kind of the connector between breaking down organic residues and making those into bite-sized pieces, that these mesoinvertebrates, that middle row of blue rectangles, they can access that energy. And then at the top here with ground beetles or centipedes as examples, these are the apex predators of a soil ecosystem. So if you're seeing or observing those kinds of soil animals, it's an indication that many, if not most, of these other groups in the web also have healthy and abundant populations. Back to the soil science part here, how are soils formed? There are typically 5 factors in soil formation or pedogenesis: the parent material, or the rock that the soil originated from, the organisms that live in and act upon that mineral component, the climate the soil forms under, topography, and time. However, since the mid-2000s, soil scientists have begun including human influence as a 6th soil forming factor. Some of what we're going to be talking about today applies generally, but we're also going to be sharing information specific to urban soils. And urban soils may be natural, may be undisturbed by human influence, or more than likely, urban soils have a significant degree of human influence acting on them. So kind of comparing a natural soil with human influence one, those are called anthropogenic soils. And then within anthropogenic soils, there are two main types here, the anthrosols and the technosols. Anthrosols are human altered, so not necessarily intentionally or by direct action. They are formed over timescales of thousands to hundreds of years. And in the soil classification system, there are kind of these adjective words that go ahead of that bigger category of anthrosol. So if you had something that was a hortic anthrosol, that is a soil that formed under many, many years of continued cultivation or gardening. So that's what's pictured here on the left, kind of has this darker, more organic, rich layer of soil on the top there. Water management or the application of manure or the confinement of livestock and manure addition that way are kind of other ways that anthrosols are shaped. And then this other group, technosols, those are characterized by the presence of artifacts, human artifacts. Artifacts is just really anything human made. It could be what we think of as something humans deposited thousands or hundreds of years ago in history, but they can also be present day things like impermeable membranes or pavement, those kinds of things. In the same system here, there are all these adjectives, these technical terms that further define or describe the technosol. Got in the next slide here, a bit more illustration of this. So urbic, that's of course a term that shares its etymology with urban, and that's where there's been a lot of residential activity by humans or settlements. Acranic, that is a French word that means shield. And so this is referring to soils where there's been pavement, either recently or further back in time. And that's what I'm showing on the left there. You can see that pavement layer with newer soil deposited on that, but the original soil profile deeper than that. There's also this isolatic kind of technosol, and that is an isolated one. So that is soil that is removed from soil in the ground. And that can refer to soil that's on a rooftop garden, like pictured here, or even if you have a container, is another example of isolatic technosol. So as I mentioned, we're sharing some information that's specific to urban soils today. And even in an urban area, there could still be natural soils that aren't too disturbed, but most of them are going to be anthropogenic in nature. And with those, we have all these possible influences on soil life. Going through those could be contamination. I've included things like heavy metals, PFAS, pesticides, microplastics, or road salt. There is plant diversity that is cultivated by humans. This could be farms, our gardens, whether that's for food or flowers, pollinator plantings, turf, other urban green spaces. There's also the non-cultivated plant diversity, typically early successional vegetation, or what a passerby might just call weeds. There may be soil amendments, different potting media, fertilizers, compost, biochar, those kinds of things that are intentionally added. And then there's the intensive types of soil management activity that happen in urban soils, like mulching, whether that's with organic or inorganic materials, use of soil fabric, tillage, cultivating in raised beds. There's the way we manage water. Through irrigation, other altered hydrology, how we make stormwater move around, and how we control or allow floodplains to function in urban areas. Animals, we've got the vertebrates. These could be urban wildlife. They could be the pets that live there. There's also examples of urban livestock in some settings. And then the invertebrate animals, these could be wild ones. These could be pests, whether those are introduced or native. And then invasive species, ones that are having disproportionate influence on native species and systems. And the final two ones are a bit like less biological in origin, and those are edge effects and ALAN, which is kind of an acronym for artificial light at night. This is that same slide, and I've just highlighted some of these aspects of urban soils that Jennifer is going to be focused on here in her section. And I have one more slide here to connect this background on soil invertebrates and soil health with what we're going to be talking about here, the organisms themselves. So a definition of soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans from our perspective. So a healthy soil, simply enough, is a living soil. Often what's taught and communicated here is pictured in this diagram. There are 4 soil health principles. The 2 on the right-hand side of the quadrant are about protecting the soil. So this means minimizing disturbance, that's both physical and chemical disturbance, and maximizing the soil cover, whether that's with living or dead organic material. And then the left 2 quadrants are about feeding that life in soil. Going back to our food web diagram and the flow of energy, the practices or principles that help feed life in the soil are to maximize continuous living roots and also to maximize the above ground biodiversity, both in terms of plants and animals there. Okay, and with that, I will hand things over to Jennifer.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie. And as you heard from Stephanie earlier, soil contains this vast diversity of life. In fact, nearly 25% of all known organisms on the planet are soil animals. So it's completely mind-blowing. And all these soil animals can play multiple important roles. And I see that we've lost Steph as a presenter, so I'm going to go ahead and troubleshoot. Steph, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Jennifer, I'm working on it.
Okay, because otherwise I can switch
Yeah,
over.
I'm back now.
Okay, super, Steph.
I'll just stay quiet until we get to Q&A.
Are you still able to advance slides? Or do you want me?
Yes, no, I am. I'll be able to do that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, great. If you can start on the decomposer slide. And Steph, I'm not able to see it.
Okay, just a minute. Yeah, I've got to get reset up here again and share again. Sorry.
That's okay. Do you want me to switch over? Or? Okay, no, great. That's super. Thanks, Steph. All right, so all these different soil animals play multiple important roles. And Steph, it's actually in, there you go, thank you. Decomposers, starting with the role of decomposers, these are animals that break down plant and animal material into bits that bacteria and fungi can more easily use. The smaller the particles, the more niches and pores for bacteria to occupy and use. So of course, microbes are really, really foundational, but these other decomposer soil animals are really important because as matter passes through their bodies, it increases the amount of opportunity for bacteria and other microbes to use. So on the next slide, you can see that that soil animals are also enriching soil by integrating nutrients. These are animals that burrow or tunnel, and as they do so, they mix nutrients and minerals between the soil layers, which influences soil structure and soil fertility. And speaking of soil structure, on the next slide, there are also soil engineers. These animals that tunnel, they are moving soil from subsoil layers to the surface. They're helping to carry air and water to deeper layers that helps aerate and hydrate the soil, and they're creating channels for plant roots. So the soil engineer's role is really important too. And on the next slide, part of this role of mixing layers of soil means that as these animals are moving through the soil layers, they're also dispersing microorganisms, fungi, and bacteria. So that's one way in which they influence microbial communities. They're also influencing microbes by making more nutrients available to them, and then also by eating them. That shifts the different microbial communities in different directions. So that's a critical role as well. And then finally, on the next slide, soil animals play multiple roles in food webs. So they can be herbivores, eating plants, they eat fungi, they eat bacteria, they're predators on other arthropods or insects or other animals in the soil, and they're parasitoids as well. So rather than eating them outright, they slowly eat their host over time. And then there are also, of course, pollinators. So many, many important ways to contribute to food webs in the soil. And all this exciting life is happening, much of it underground, out of our sight. On the next slide, as Steph mentioned, soil animals can range from microscopic to large. The smallest soil animals, like the nematodes, the tardigrades, the rotifers, and the protozoa that you see here, live in water films. They're often the most abundant beyond microbes. The next largest groups, the mesofauna, are microarthropods, potworms. They live within pores in the soil. And then you have the larger arthropods, the mollusks, the crustaceans, the annelids, and those make their own spaces and burrows within the soil. Today, we're just showcasing soil animals that are especially valuable in soil health in urban settings, and subsetting that even further, focusing on those that we can see with our naked eye. So starting with mites, which are very tiny, but are still visible with our naked eye. And mites are among the most diverse groups that you're going to find in the soil, and often are one of the most abundant as well. Mites are super decomposers, breaking down organic matter into bits that are used by bacteria. They are, and in addition to decomposing, there are some that are also predatory on smaller soil life, like nematodes or springtails. They help disperse microbes like bacteria and fungi. They move between soil, or they exist in different layers in the soil. And the mite fauna can be very characteristic of particular soil types and also of plant communities, and can be indicators of past vegetative communities. The picture you see here of the beetle with a bunch of mites attached is meant to illustrate how some mites can move quickly by hitching a ride on other animals, and they can move between dung pats or carcasses in this way and disperse even further. Our next group are the springtails, and these get their common name from the way they propel themselves around, bouncing around essentially. They live in the leaf litter on the soil surface, as well as in different soil layers, including deep soil. So there are springtails that have reduced eyesight or are blind because they live so deep in the soil. And springtails also contribute to decomposition by fragmenting plants and fungi, and they also influence soil microbe communities. They can drive fungal communities, they can stimulate fungal growth, for example, and they can also stunt microbial growth as well. Our next group are the woodlice, or isopods. These are crustaceans, and while most crustaceans are aquatic, this is a terrestrial group. However, they're still really closely tied to moisture. They really only can survive in moist places because they lose water so easily in their body. And there are two main groups of woodlice. The sow bugs, pictured up top here, have two appendages off their back end that can help indicate them really quickly. And then, of course, you're probably quite familiar with pill bugs, which are also known as roly-polies. And isopods are primary decomposers. They fragment fresh debris and break down detritus. Some actually have specific preferences for fresh leaves. They might prefer holly over oak leaves, for example. And they have bacteria in their guts that help them break down plant materials. About 1/3 of the species in North America are introduced. Most of the native isopods in North America found in the south or along shorelines or in caves. All pill bugs are introduced from Europe. So all of the familiar species are introduced, and woodlice are unique that they can tolerate heavy metals and accumulate them within their bodies and can be used for monitoring of heavy metal contaminants in soils. Our next group are the millipedes. On the next slide, millipedes are elongated bodies with multiple legs per segment, 2 legs per segment. And as you might remember from grade school, a millipede means 1,000 feet. Most millipedes actually have 50 to 400 legs, but just in the last 2 years, the world record holder of most legs of any animal on the planet was discovered from a sample of soil from 60 meters deep in Australia, and that millipede had 1,300 legs. So that blew away the record. Millipedes have chewing mouth parts, and they are also important decomposers. They fragment about 10 to 15% of the annual leaf fall, for example, and facilitate microbial decomposition in that way. They're really powerful diggers. And so they move from the leaf litter down into deeper soil and in the process disperse microbes within those layers. They can be long-lived as well, up to 11 years. Our next group, the crabid beetles, are insects. And this is our first group of predators so far today, both the larval stage, which you can see pictured in the middle there, and the adults are predatory. They feed on larger animals like slugs and snails, as well as other insects like caterpillars and grasshoppers. They can be important in biological control, conservation biological control in particular, and contribute to the control of crop pests in agricultural settings. Some also eat decaying plant material, and some also eat weed seeds. So this is a very important group. They live on the soil surface or in the upper layer of the soil and in leaf litter. And permanent habitat is really important for ground beetles. They overwinter in clumps of bunch grass. This is another group that is long-lived. They just have 1 generation a year and can live up to 4 years. So they grow fairly slowly. And it's another one that's closely associated with plant communities. Specific species can be tied to specific plant communities. Our next group of predators are spiders. Spiders have 8 legs, 2 body regions, multiple eyes, and chelicera for injecting into their prey. And they are predatory throughout their life, from nymphs to adults. And pictured here are hunting spiders, which are often more visible. Hunting spiders chase down their prey in leaf litter or on the soil. So wolf spiders, ground spiders, and jumping spiders. But there are also other spiders that make nests on the soil surface or within a silken tunnel, and they trap their prey or ambush their prey. They are important in soil systems as well. Spiders can also play a role in controlling crop pests, and they also rely on permanent habitat because they're sensitive to chemical and physical disturbances in agricultural fields. And again, they can be long-lived, so they can take some time to recover from disturbances. Our last group that I wanted to highlight today are earthworms. And this is very likely extremely familiar to you all. Earthworms burrow in the soil, they consume leaf litter, and they can alter soil properties in many beneficial ways, improving the soil structure, increasing aeration, helping with water transmission. They can accelerate decomposition and make nutrients more available for plants. For example, the earthworm casts, their waste, have 50% more nutrients than the surrounding soil. So they can be very, very beneficial. And as a couple cool side notes, earthworms can regenerate some of the segments that are lost off their back end. And all individuals have both male and female organs to help with, they're hermaphroditic, to help with mating. And individuals can be long-lived up to 4 years. And in the United States, much like with isopods, we have a bunch of introduced species of earthworms. Native earthworms really have a restricted to the eastern states and the Pacific coast states. And in the upper Midwest, it's thought that the last glaciation really wiped out native earthworm populations. We have many introduced species that are very familiar, like night crawlers and the red wigglers that are pictured here. These are species that have become really ubiquitous around the world and have a global distribution now. What's interesting about earthworms is that not all species are beneficial in all settings. For example, there's some introduced species that deplete leaf litter, don't mix nutrients, and can even contribute to soil erosion. So earthworms are not ubiquitous superstars of soil health in every single setting. And just to go a little bit deeper, for example, jumping worms are a suite of species that were introduced from Asia. These are really recognizable from their wiggling and thrashing wildly behavior. And they also have a clitellum, that's the reproductive structures, a smooth band that's located closest to the head, that's white or creamy in color and wraps all the way around its body, as opposed to other earthworms that don't have it wrapping all the way, including on the underside. So jumping worms, particularly in forests, alter the soil structure in ways that's really detrimental, can actually increase erosion, and they can consume leaf litter, but they don't mix it in with the soil. They just remove leaf litter, which takes away habitat from beneficial invertebrates, from birds, from other animals. They can also actually increase soil disturbance, which can make it easier for invasive plants to spread. So this is a group of worms that has actually become actively invasive in many places, including the upper Midwest. They can spread aggressively because they can survive cold winters as eggs within cocoons. They can reproduce without fertilization, and they can outcompete other earthworms. And currently, there are no ways to prevent or to control, excuse me, there are no ways to control jumping worms. So once you have an infestation, your best bet is to limit the spread, to prevent them from moving, expanding their range further. So this means being very careful not to release worms that were used for composting or for bait. It also means when you are sharing compost or you're buying compost, making sure that it's been treated in a composting facility that's reached really high temperatures, which can destroy the cocoon that jumping worms have their egg protected within. If you're sharing plants, it's also be good to be cautious if you have a jumping worm infestation, and clean soil from vehicles or equipment when you're moving from a site that's been infested to other sites. All right, so Steph called attention to fireflies earlier, but it's just one great example of how many insects have a life stage connected to the soil. Fireflies, of course, are this beloved group of organisms, and it really can be a surprise to learn that they have such an important connection to the soil. Their larvae hunt and track down earthworms and slugs, for example, in the soil, and they overwinter in the soil and pupate in the soil as well. So we wouldn't have these beautiful, beautiful creatures without healthy soil. And then again, soil too, of course, is important to a wide array of pollinators. And in Heather's presentation, she highlighted a number of bees that build nests in the ground. Over 75 to 80% of species in North America nest in the ground for native bees. And some wasps also nest in the ground, and hoverflies as well have larvae that are decomposers, feeding on plant and animal material, and beetles as well. So there are many, many animals that live mostly above ground that depend directly on the soil for one stage of their life or more. All right, next we're going to transition and talk a little bit about management and how we can impact these soil animals and how we can support them. In urban spaces, soil invertebrates can be diverse as well as abundant, and their communities can be influenced by the physical properties and chemical properties of soil, but also by the past land use and management as well. And Steph highlighted soil invertebrates can be sensitive to many human activities. And the next slide, just to summarize really quickly some of the main factors and their influence on soil life. And I apologize, there seems to be some formatting issues that we're having with some of our slides. But really briefly, with less soil disturbance, there's more soil life. With more pesticides, there's less soil life. For example, broad spectrum insecticides can decrease abundance and diversity of a lot of different groups, not just insects, but many other invertebrates as well. With heavy metals, most soil invertebrates decrease in numbers with heavy metal contamination, with the exception of isopods, of course, which seem to do quite well in metal contaminated soils. Irrigation can have variable effects depending on where you are. And if you, for example, in arid areas, irrigation can increase soil life, influence soil communities. Fertilization, organic fertilizers that have a living origin help to increase organic matter in soil structure, and that can be very beneficial in urban soils. And then finally, plant communities can be influential as well. The more diverse plant communities influence life beneath the soil. So more diversity equals more soil life below ground. And Steph already highlighted some of these health practices. Soil health practices support soil life, and of course, soil life supports plant growth. I'm just going to, on the next few slides, on the next slide, go one by one through the soil health principles and translate them to urban settings and management activities in urban settings. To start with, physical disturbances can impact soil animals by disrupting their habitat. So tillage, for example, can break up soil structure, but also can break up tunnels that soil animals are using. So it's important to limit physical soil disturbances whenever possible, especially because some of these soil animals that have their life stages dependent on the soil can take quite a long time to recover from soil disturbances. Chemical disturbances are also impactful. In particular, I mentioned that pesticides can have negative impacts on many of these soil animals. They can take a longer time to recover because they have longer life cycles and shorter growing stages. Pesticides can also lead to secondary pest outbreaks. So pests that were previously suppressed by beneficial predators or parasitoids, when those species are removed from the setting, the pest can flourish because it doesn't have its natural enemy to control. So that means when it comes to managing pests, that we should really focus on integrated pest management. And if you can click forward, Steph, integrated pest management starts, the foundation of which is really to prevent pest outbreaks, reducing the conditions that lead to pest development, so you can minimize the need for intervention later on. So prevention in urban settings can be using pest exclusion, like floating row covers. It can be rotating different crops in garden beds or in urban farms. And it can be using resistant varieties. And then that can be followed up by monitoring and scouting, so you know if your pest reaches an economic threshold when control is needed, and then when control is needed, seeking the safest pest control measures possible. Next, another important soil health principle is to maximize cover, to keep the soil covered at all times. This can be with living cover. Pictured here is a cover crop that is growing amongst strawberries in Steph's garden. Cover crops can help build soil organic matter, they can suppress weeds, they can hold the soil down, and they can provide habitat for soil animals, as well as if they're left to flower, to pollinators too. But you can also cover the soil with inert covers like organic mulch, which like leaf litter, pine needles, larger pieces of bark or wool mulch. This can help conserve water and suppress weeds. You can also allow some crop residues to decompose, but the idea is to keep the soil covered all the time. This cover helps with soil health, but cover also helps to reduce exposure to lead contamination in soil. And this is a particular issue in many urban spaces that have a legacy of lead plant use on older structures or different types of factories that released lead that traveled. Another principle of soil health is on the next slide, to maximize continuous living roots. This means to keep living roots growing throughout the year. So in garden beds, this means to reduce fallow periods where you have nothing living. So this could be that you grow crops that are season-long crops, as well as successional crop planting. So during the growing season, there's always something growing. And then it could mean at the end of the growing season that you add in a cover crop that makes it through the winter. Or it could mean that you also grow perennials. But the idea is that you've always got roots in the soil that are alive, because those roots provide a source of food for microbes. Microbes really rely on the root exudates as a feeding source. So that's really foundational for the soil food web. And on the next slide, the last principle is to really maximize biodiversity, to grow as many species of plants as possible. So this can be rotating crops, having successional crops, growing cover crops, but outside of garden beds, in yards, and other places, it can be prioritizing permanent habitat with native plants. This is important for soil health, of course, but it also supports pollinators and beneficial insects. And again, is another way to really minimize heavy metal contamination in soil. A couple of specific examples of ways to maximize biodiversity with native plants is hedgerows. These are rows of shrubs or trees or perennials. They support pollinators in urban landscapes and can also be sources of food for people. Another example are beetle banks. These are long-term plantings with bunch grasses that can have wildflowers integrated, but these are permanent habitats for specifically for soil animals like spiders and ground beetles that really need that overwintering. Just quickly moving on to the next management practice, artificial light can impact soil animals by drawing them away from habitat, drawing them towards artificial light, which can be hazardous, disrupting mating. So it's really important to reduce cosmetic artificial light whenever possible. Use lights only where it's necessary, use it only when it's necessary. So using timers or motion detectors to limit the use of artificial light at night. If you're looking for resources as an urban producer, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, their website has a number of resources. Xerces has partner biologists that can provide technical support. On the next slide, if you reach out to us, we have partner biologists that can help you develop certain practices within urban settings specifically to help support pollinators as well as soil health. We also have a number of resources available through our website, available for downloading. Just for example, and I'll put these links in the chat, but on the next slide, you can see that we have specific soil life publications. I'll stick our website in the chat in just a minute, including a pocket guide for bioindicators, a soil scouting guide, and then we have a farming with soil life guide that was published by SARE and is available through their website. You can get involved in community science involving soil life with our Firefly atlas that allows people to contribute to our understanding of firefly species.